Hey, today I'm doing a video on how I breed predatory mites. So I did a video on this originally almost a year ago now, and I've made some changes to the way that I do it. Not a lot of huge changes, so I would definitely recommend you go and check out that video, and especially some of the comments that people left asking questions and talking about some of the ways that they have adapted the method. The response in that video has been really good. So I wanted to do an update, a kind of simplified method that I'm doing now, but I'm happy to say that all of my mites from that original video are still healthy, thriving. I still have cultures going, and I think the last time I purchased mites was when I checked almost a year ago. So if you want to learn how to breed your own predatory mites, then keep watching. So I'll start off with the items that you need to put a mite breeding culture together. So first thing you're definitely going to need is some mites. Now, what I have here are Cucumera's mites. I have also tried this method with Swartsky mites and Californicus mites. Cucumera's and Swartsky mites are really good for thrips. Californicus mites are really good for spider mites. Now, the type of mites that are available to you will vary depending on where you are in the world. So you're going to want to check with your beneficial insect provider, see what species of mite it is, and check whether or not they eat pollen. Mites that exclusively feed on live prey can be more difficult to rear. So this tutorial is going to focus on mites that feed on pollen when there aren't other prey sources available. So there's a popular mite. The species is Scomitus. I think they're also known as Hyopsis mites. They are soil dwelling. They're actually also very easy to culture and keep alive because they feed on things like fungus and springtails in soil. So they're really good for like bioactive enclosures. And you'll actually see some of those in this video, but we're not specifically targeting those for our culture this time, since they don't feed on pollen and they're a soil-dwelling mite. So to actually feed the mites, talked about that we need mites that will eat pollen when there are no other sources of prey available. So we want to get our hands on some sort of pollen. I've used pine pollen. You should be able to use bee pollen. This is usually available as like a health food additive, so it's not too hard to get your hands on. In addition to our feeding regimen that is new to this updated video is yeast of some variety. So this yeast is going to feed the feeder mites that our target species will hopefully feed on. So in each of these slow release sachets, and apparently it's sachets, but I always call them sachets, I'm sorry. In each of these packets that you get, if we open these up, sometimes they'll be a lot smaller than this. This is a more slow release pack, so there is more food in here. So if you open one of these up, what you'll see is contained inside. The stuff that's inside is just bran. Now, the point of this bran is that it basically grows a mold that bran mites, some kind of bran mite, can eat. So that bran mite eats all the fungus, breeds, reproduces, and that is the feeder mite that the target beneficial might eat. So the beneficial mites will eat pollen as a backup, but they actually reproduce a lot more vigorously when they can feed on some sort of live prey. So we want to try and replicate that in our cultures as much as possible. So to do that, instead of bran growing yeast, we are going to introduce some yeast ourselves. So this is a new addition to this updated method. I found it really just explodes the population of the feeder mites, adding a little bit of instant yeast. I keep mine in the freezer to keep it fresh longer, and I just take it directly out of the freezer and apply it to my cultures. So this will feed the feeder mites, which will help feed our target mites. Next thing we're gonna need is some cotton rounds. Technically, you don't have to use these cotton facial rounds. You could just use normal cotton if you had a larger container. But for the containers I like to use, these cotton rounds are just the right size. The reason we need cotton is the mites lay their eggs on the strands of cotton. So in the wild, they would be laying their eggs on the little filaments that grow on plant leaves. But to simulate that, we're using cotton. You need some water to wet those cotton rounds. It's really important for mites to keep the humidity high in order for them to be able to breed. So we're going to manage the amount of moisture in these cultures that we're creating. And I find a little squeezy bottle. This is, what was it called? A tattoo wash bottle is really good. I've just snipped the top off mine so the water comes out in a slightly larger, lower pressure stream. These are really helpful when you're maintaining your cultures each week. We also need some sort of waterproof platform to keep the mites dry and away from the moisture that we're going to keep at the bottom of our cultures. They like to be humid, but they don't like to be wet. So in my previous video, the original, according to a instruction guide that I had read, which I will link in this description as well, they suggested using wax squares with the impression of a mesh screen on top. So there were almost these little channels where the mites could walk. Now, I found that just using simple plastic works just as well as those wax squares. So I've switched to doing this because it just saves you a whole step. This is just an acetate sheet. I think I found it called a binding cover. There's nothing special about this. You just need some sort of water barrier, essentially. And of course, a pair of scissors so that we can cut our plastic into a shape to fit our container. Last on our list is some type of container to contain the mites. Now, I like to use these petri dishes. The reason I like to use petri dishes is because, for one, I can stack them. So these are my mite cultures that are already established. I like to be able to take these and move them around amongst my plants. And also, because the containers are small, if something goes wrong in one of these containers, I don't end up killing all of the mites. I only have to redo the one container. Now, downsides to these petri dishes, obviously they are quite thin. And if your cotton is too thick and it ends up like touching the lid of the petri dish, sometimes you can get condensation, and then the condensation saturates these cotton pads where the mites are supposed to be breeding. And if they get saturated with water, the mites are not going to be able to breed or live in there. They'll basically end up drowning. So that's more likely to happen in a smaller container. Some people like to use larger containers than this. It's not my preferred method, but that definitely works. You can kind of just use what you have. If you use something that's narrower than your cotton, you're going to have a hard time rehydrating the cotton to maintain the cultures. You'll see what I mean later when I go through and do my weekly maintenance on my existing cultures. These petri dishes, it's important to note they don't seal at the top. If you have a container that is sealed, you're going to want to add ventilation. So you can do that by heating up like a fork or something on the stove and poking some holes. I have done that for some of these petri dishes. You can do that to these petri dishes as well, especially if you notice excess mold growing. It might just be that you need some more airflow. Keep in mind that the mites are very small, so that also means that they're probably going to escape. So either keep the mites with your plants, or keep them in a greenhouse cabinet, or keep them in some kind of larger container if you don't want them crawling away before you can get them to your plants. Last item would be just some kind of marker so that you can label your cultures. You want to know which mites you're working with, because if you mix up your mites, they'll kind of end up just eating each other, and you don't really want that. So marker, definitely important. So now we're going to actually go and put a culture together. So I have my petri dish. I'm going to put one cotton round at the bottom of my dish. I'm going to get that wet. It's okay if you spill over a little bit. We want this to be pretty much saturated. Next, we're going to take our piece of plastic and we're just going to cut a shape roughly the same size as our container. So we want it to be bigger than the cotton round, but we don't want it to go right to the edge. You could definitely actually mark this with like a marker and trace your container, but I don't think that step is super useful. I usually just eyeball it. The mites don't really care. So that is good. So again, we want it so that we're gonna be able to basically lift this out later, because when we're doing our maintenance on our cultures, we have to keep this cotton round on the bottom wet to maintain the humidity. So something like this that takes up most of the surface area but still allows us to lift it out is just perfect. So next we want our packet of beneficial mites. So this bran is going to contain some yeast, it's going to contain some feeder mites, and it's going to contain some cucumaris mites in this case. So we're just going to take some of that bran and put it in our culture. Now, unfortunately, this bran will get moldy. You'll find that the mites will eventually kind of, and just from lifting it up when we do this, we might end up knocking it into this wet portion down here, so it might go moldy. Once you have your mites and they've kind of transitioned to living on these cotton rounds, then you can get rid of this bran. But for now, we need the bran to introduce the mites. So next, we're going to feed the mites a little bit of pollen. Now, we want to start off with just a very, very small amount when our culture is growing and we don't know if it'll take or not. This pine pollen in particular really likes to stick together. So if you can see that, I'm just using like a tiniest little bit of this is a 1/4 teaspoon. If your cultures are going moldy, it might be because you're using too much pollen. Especially at the start, we want to gauge how much the mites are actually using. When it's not used, it'll be this bright yellow color. So that pollen, again, the feeder mites will feed on this pollen if there is nothing else. In my original video, I was feeding them only the pine pollen and they were able to survive. I don't know, there must have been yeast or something growing on the pollen that they were able to eat. But next we're gonna add a little bit of yeast, and this will really help the feeder mites to get going. Again, we're gonna wanna start with just a very small amount until we know we actually have some mites growing. Next, we're going to take a dry cotton round, very important that this stays dry, and just put it on top of that to give the mites a place to breed. Then we're gonna close up the culture, label it, these are cucumaris mites, and that's it. That is how you assemble the culture. Now, if you have some cultures going already, once the cultures seem like they're doing well, I usually add another cotton pad and kind of end up sandwiching the food in between these two pads to distribute the mites. You can see there's a fair amount of mites in this one. So for this one, I would just take one of the old cotton pads, put it down. I just add some pollen directly to that. I'd add a little pinch of yeast to that. And then I'd put a fresh cotton pad on top of everything. I'll just seal those up and then we're ready to go. Once you have your cultures made, you can stack them, you can distribute them amongst your plants. These don't need any extra humidity, so you don't need to keep them in like a bin or a greenhouse cabinet. You can if you want to, but these are also good to just keep in room humidity as they are. I like to keep 10 Swarovski mites for thrips and 10 Californicus mites for spider mites. I find any more than that and it just takes too long to do this weekly maintenance. This amount of mites is better for prevention. I do still buy packets like these slow release packets when I have a big outbreak of, say, thrips and it's affecting a lot of plants at once. But if you have like a couple plants that are affected at a time, then this amount has definitely been enough to, say, eradicate spider mites from my anthurium greenhouse cabinet. So now I'm going to show you the weekly kind of maintenance that I do on these. Now, these are quite old. Some of them have been around for a couple months, so they do end up looking kind of grimy. When they start getting too yucky, you can kind of just clean them out and start over. But I just want to show you that this is the reality and it doesn't necessarily affect how the mites are doing. So let's start with the Swarovski mites. I'm gonna bring this a little closer. Now you can use gloves or like tweezers or something. These don't really bother me. So I just use my fingers, but obviously you can do whatever you want to. So first thing I am gonna do is lift up the plastic. I am going to squirt some water in the bottom. Now in the bottom of this culture, you'll see some little insects running around. Some of them might be kind of trapped by the water. But the little gray silvery insects that are running around, those are springtails. They will naturally be drawn to your cultures. They eat mold and they're not harmful at all. They don't compete with the beneficial mites, so it's totally okay if you have those guys at the bottom of your cultures. Now I usually put the plastic back on top. In this one I have 2 cotton pads. I'll usually do a quick assessment of how the mites are doing. So you should actually be able to see those gloms of mites with your naked eye. Those are feeder mites. I'll give you a close-up of what those look like under a digital microscope. But the way that you can tell the feeder mites apart from your beneficial, the feeder mites have like clear bodies and a dark reddish head and legs. And like I said, they tend to kind of glom together, whereas your beneficial mites will move a lot quicker. And usually their bodies and legs appear the same color. So don't worry if you're not spotting any beneficial mites in your cultures. Basically, they're just a lot harder to spot. But if you have a nice healthy feeder mite population, then chances are you also have a healthy beneficial mite population. If you have a digital microscope and you want to go searching for them, then go for it. So you should be able to see in this culture, this pollen here kind of looks like it hasn't been touched. So I'm just going to leave that alone. And I'm actually just going to add some yeast to this. Now I do this routine once a week. So I put about that much yeast in this time last week, and you can see that it's basically all been eaten. Now, this is also a time where you could take and use this cotton pad to either make a new culture, or I could take this and basically harvest it, take it out of this culture, put a new cotton pad on, and just put this in with my plants. Now, I'll be honest, I haven't found a very good dispersal method for these cotton rounds that are impregnated with eggs and possibly adult beneficials as well. What I find is it's difficult to keep these cotton rounds from getting wet while also not letting them dry out. Beneficial mites generally thrive at humidities of like 70% or higher. So I've tried putting them in like little containers like this and putting them around my plants with little holes in the side so the mites can escape, but I'm not convinced that this is like the best method. So if you have a good method for that, please leave it in the comments. I have also in the past basically repurposed these packets where I don't cut them all the way open. I just kind of cut a slit and then I'll put the packets in. But for me, what has worked the best is just basically keeping these cultures fed and then using these as the distribution system. So I'll just put these in with my plants wherever I need them. The mites can kind of escape out of these anyways. This is an example of one where I have the holes melted in, but even if they don't have that, they can still escape from the side of the rim. So I figure I might as well just put these, like put the plant on top. So that one is done. Let's do another one. You can see that the cotton round starts to kind of disintegrate over time. So if you need to, you can add a fresh one. See how the cotton is almost kind of like sticking together? That's really because the mites have dug in there and kind of buried themselves to lay eggs. See how on here there's almost no like granular pollen that you can see and no yeast. Again, I added yeast and pollen to these last week, so they've actually eaten a ton in the past little bit. So I'm gonna give those guys some pollen. I've still found it beneficial to add pollen even though the beneficials do seem to prefer the yeast. And because I know that this is quite an active culture, I'm gonna add a little bit more of both. You may also start to see mites on the top of your cotton when the culture is getting larger. That's a good sign that your mites are actively growing. Check on this one. You can see all the mites moving around in there. So it might take a couple weeks before you actually start to see mites. And you might not be able to really see them individually. It might be more just movement. They really don't look like very much at first. But I'd say probably like give it a good 3 weeks before you give up on your cultures completely. It's possible that your original packets just did not have a very big mite population to begin with. Maybe they were old, maybe you accidentally got these cotton rounds wet and then they weren't able to breed. It's the beginning that's the most challenging. Once you have them kind of established, it's easier to keep them going. This one is quite old, which you can see from the amount of old, kind of used up pollen there is. So this is what a healthy culture is going to look like. If you have mold in your culture, it means that the mites are not eating the yeast or whatever fast enough. So you're either overfeeding or your cotton has somehow gotten wet. So if this shifts over to the side and ends up like absorbing some of the water from the bottom and these cotton rounds become soaked, that is a really quick way to get your cultures going all moldy and basically to kill off the population. So it's super key that these top guys remain dry. If you have your cultures in a warm area where the sun is hitting them or they're in like a greenhouse or something, that is going to cause this water to evaporate faster. It'll condense on the lid. And then if the cotton round at the top is touching, like I mentioned earlier, that can also cause the top cotton to get wet, and then your mites won't be able to breed. Again, there's like no yeast left from the last time I fed them, so these guys are doing really good. And how I know that I have beneficials in here as well, I've seen them under my microscope, and I also often see them crawling around my plants, especially in my greenhouse cabinet where the humidity is higher. Now, another type of mite you might see in your cultures, you might notice mites that tend to live at the bottom of your dishes You might start to see them if your cultures do get moldy. You may see these mites that are larger than the feeder mites. And if you look really closely at them, you might even see they have almost like a triangle pattern on their back. Those are going to be your scomitus mites. So those are also beneficial insects. They're really great to have in your cultures. They are generally soil dwelling. They're feeding on the mold and stuff at the bottom of your cultures, just like the springtails are. They might also be eating some of the springtails as well. So if you see those guys with the little triangles on their back, they are actually great. We want those. If you want specifically to grow the scomitus mites, I generally have them in my isopod bins. So what I do will just take any kind of like old plant matter, old substrate, and just put it in a bin. I've introduced those scomitus mites that I purchased, and they are very, very easy to maintain the population. That's basically what they need. They just need some soil and mold to feed on, which is going to be present in pretty much any organic substrate. That's it for the Swartsky mites. Now I'm going to do the Californicus mites. Now here's an example of all that black stuff is, well, used to be that bran. All the other cultures don't smell. This one kind of smells a little bit because of that bran. So if you can prevent it from falling down to the bottom, and you can kind of get rid of it once the cultures get to a certain size, then I would recommend that, because the bran unfortunately makes them pretty gross. And this one has a lot of like old pollen versus the new pollen, and you can see the color difference is like a dead giveaway. Okay, here's a good example compared to some of those other cultures of one that isn't doing as well. So I gave all of the cultures the same amount of food last week, but you can see that there's still some yeast that's been uneaten in here. Same with the pollen. You can see it's still in like clumps. It hasn't been dispersed by the mites. And the pollen is starting to go moldy because they haven't eaten it fast enough. So this is an example where I gave them too much food. You can see there are mites in there. The population just isn't big enough to handle what I fed them. So I'm gonna not give this one any pollen and just a little bit of yeast, because there are live mites. I can see them, but don't want to overdo it. So yeah, some people ask whether mites will like take over your house, and they really won't. Mites need these specific conditions to breed. They need those filaments, and they really don't live that long on their own. They need high humidity to be able to thrive, and they're going to seek and hunt out their preferred prey, which is those spider mites or thrips larvae. So if you don't have those conditions, the mites have no reason to like be in your house. In order to make your mites the most effective and give them the best conditions, I would recommend keeping your plants either in like a tote, or I will sometimes put a bag over them if I know that they have pests. This not only helps to prevent the pests themselves from spreading, but it will help the mites to have high humidity and basically live longer in your plants. See, here's another example of a culture that does not have a very big population. It has some mites, but most of the food has been untouched. And like I said, I fed them all about the same amount. So I'm not actually going to add anything to this culture. I'm just going to leave it as is. But yeah, a bag can really help extend the life of any mites that you raise from your culture, because it would be a shame if they do really well in these cultures and then they crawl out onto your plant and then they die because the humidity isn't high enough. Here's another gross one where all that bran has gone moldy. Not a fan of that. I should probably clean this one out, but the mites don't really care. So can I just put pollen directly on my plants? You can do that. Interestingly, I found a article that basically said the beneficial insects lasted longer, but it also increased like the thrips populations. So I wouldn't recommend it. Also, if your plants don't have the little hair fibers on their leaves, the mites won't necessarily have anything to breed. So they may last a little bit longer feeding on the pollen, but you still need these cultures to breed them, and you run the risk of increasing your pest population as well. And last one. This one's kind of interesting because this is one where the cotton did get wet and started to go moldy, and the mites mostly died off, but now the population is starting to revive. You can tell it's not as big as the other ones because we still have some of the pollen that's like hasn't been fully eaten, but it has actually managed to recover. Sometimes I don't know if I've actually fully lost a culture or not, and I'll just keep feeding it for a little bit just to see if it'll recover. Sometimes they do, sometimes there's not enough mites to keep it going, and sometimes it's easier to just refresh it by transferring a cotton round from a healthy culture. But all of these are doing really well today. Now the last step would be to put the mites in with the plants I know need it. A lot of my plants have thrips right now, so they're already prepped with some of these bags to keep the humidity high. I'll usually just kind of like rest the cultures on the pot, or some of them I will just put the culture underneath the pot and let the mites crawl out. Sometimes I'll just kind of leave them beside the pot so that the mites can crawl out. All of those methods will work for dispersing the beneficials. Okay, so that is it for my update and simplified method on breeding your own predatory mites. As always, please leave comments if you have questions. I will do my best to answer them. I'm also happy to hear about methods that you have found successful. This isn't the only way to do it, but it has really worked for me and has helped significantly with my treatment of pests and keeping my plants nice and healthy. Thank you so much for watching. Please consider subscribing if you are not subscribed, and I will see you in the next one. Bye. Excuse me, are you a mite? Are you a mite? You don't get to eat pollen. You don't get to eat the pollen. Silly. Silly bird. Grr. Excuse me. Excuse me, sir. Excuse me. Excuse me. What are you doing? What are you doing? Yeah, no, let's not do that. Come on. Thank you.